But before I jump into the materials, I give a brief sort of introduction of myself and background. I'm the CEO of PMP. PMP is a marketing firm that exclusively focuses on consumer law firms and primarily plaintiffs' personal injury law firms. We've been around for a little over 15 years. We were actually started by John Morgan of Morgan and Morgan. Started as like a lead referral network that evolved into kind of an ad agency and has since evolved from there. I came on board in really 2022. I acquired PMP from John and his then partner. They were looking for sort of off-ramps. John was getting competitive as Morgan & Morgan grew across the nation with a lot of our clients, and his partner was looking for a path to retirement. And so I partnered with private equity firm based in Chicago and acquired PMP, had a little overlap, and I'm now repositioning PMP for sort of the future of advertising and also advertising within personal injury law specifically. My background, I started my career in the entertainment industry. I worked in creative development at a studio called Skydance Media, which actually just acquired Paramount as of like this week, but it was a much smaller company then. From there, I went to business school. I went to Indiana University's Kelley School of Business to get my MBA because I wanted to pursue something a little bit more entrepreneurial. And then I spent a couple of years working in management consulting with Deloitte's consulting practice based out of Chicago. Because of my media experience, the sort of best sort of translation of that to Fortune 500 happened to be advertising strategies for large companies that were either in growth strategy mode or going through mergers and acquisitions integrations. And so I worked a lot in advertising strategy, and particularly how to best to use consumer data to improve advertising strategies for these large companies. And then from there, I got connected with this private equity firm and had the opportunity to acquire PMP. I come from a family of lawyers, so I was familiar with the space. My mom's a judge, my dad's an attorney, my sister's a former attorney, and thought that the core business of PMP and the clients we serve was really compelling. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to improve on what we do for our clients. So with that said, I'm going to share my screen and kind of chat through what I think is compelling and oftentimes missing from discussions at least conferences that I attend. I think it's an under sort of exposed or discussed topic within the context of marketing for personal injury law firms. So one moment while I share my screen. And please, if you have questions or anything, feel free to unmute or put on your video and shout them out. And like I mentioned, I'd like to make this sort of equal parts presentation-y, but also I'm assuming a lot of you have grappled with some of these things and approach them in different ways within your own firms. And so I'd love to sort of have the discussion beyond, go beyond what I'm sharing exclusively. All right. So I hope you all can share my screen. I can see Gloria and Elizabeth. So if you could give me a thumbs up. Do you see the presentation materials? All right, awesome. Thank you. So jumping in, the objective today is to discuss the importance of brand and creative strategy in personal injury law marketing. And my desired outcome is to hopefully maybe challenge some assumptions you all have, and then also provide some practical tips for sharpening our collective approach on how we develop and communicate our brands. I have the sort of vantage point of how we inform and advise our clients. And we've got a little over 30 clients in 40 different markets across the United States. And so some of this stuff is what we incorporate into our service offering, and certainly how we think about strategically advising our clients on how to manage their marketing campaigns. So the agenda today, I want to share a couple of governing beliefs that I have and we have about sort of the personal injury law and consumer law marketing space. I want to talk a little bit about kind of what we control as marketers, talk about some practical constraints that we face specifically within personal injury law. And then I want to discuss brand strategy specifically, conceptually, but then also share, we do some workshops with our clients, and there's certain exercises that we do to sort of activate or illuminate elements of their brand strategy that help clarify how we want to communicate on their behalf. And so I'm going to go through some of those sample exercises, including example outputs from clients that we've worked with on this stuff, to just give a little bit more texture so it's not super academic and conceptual. So a couple of like governing beliefs that we have at PMP that govern our approach to to marketing, they're shaped by a couple of macro trends that we observe. So the first is increasing competition. So certainly there are more personal injury law firms each year. It's not a dramatic growth rate. What is dramatic is that when you look back sort of 10 or 15 years ago, the number of personal injury law firms that were really focused on advertising was much smaller. And so the success of those firms has bred a lot of competition, which makes the landscape a little bit more difficult because it's more people investing more money going after roughly sort of the same number of addressable cases in their respective markets. So there's increasing competition, which makes things a little bit more difficult for us. Number two is channel diversification. So similarly, if you go back 10 or 15 years ago, if you had a healthy broadcast spend and some good TV ads, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit and your phone would ring. I'm oversimplifying, but not dramatically so. Since then, the media landscape has evolved and there's a bunch of different platforms, obviously, that people can advertise on, and certainly also a bunch of different platforms that audience members can consume media on. So that makes things more difficult because there's channel fragmentation. So it's not just as simple as, say, putting up a good daytime TV spot on Judge Judy or Price is Right, letting it run, and your phone would ring, and you would get a sufficient number of cases to offset your marketing budget. So that makes things a little bit more difficult as well. And the last piece here, there's a primary macro trend that we think about is the influx of institutional capital. And this isn't necessarily something that we talk a lot about as marketers, but it's a practical reality. New finance mechanisms, whether it's lending or even private equity coming through the form of like alternative business structures in Arizona or other places, allows for an influx of institutional capital in an environment that was primarily historically dominated by just frankly small business owners who are funding growth through their own pocket or their own take-home cash flow. What this is demanding is increased professionalization of the competitors in the space because this institutional capital demands sort of slightly different returns than small to medium-sized law firm owners. So this is a macro trend that changes things, and all of these things combined, in my mind, make things a little bit more difficult for law firms to succeed in marketing compared to maybe what some are used to, or certainly what was the case maybe 5, 10, 15 years ago. But it's not impossible. And the reality is we can be frustrated that it is more difficult, or maybe the cost to participate is higher. But we should also be really practical about how to stay ahead of it and be smart about it and how to navigate this reality. I would posit that we should be treating personal injury marketing like insurance company marketing or consumer packaged goods marketing, bringing the same level of sophistication and strategies and tactics that you see in other industries that, in my view, are much more sort of mature and sophisticated based on the economics of those industries. We need to borrow those best practices and apply them as adroitly as we can in our space of personal injury law marketing. So I push our team, I push our clients to think about it this way. The competition practically on the landscape is insurance companies. We're suing insurance companies. And their marketing spend across the major insurance carriers by far and away dwarfs that of what the collection of plaintiffs' personal injury law firms can afford. And with that comes a lot more sophistication, resources, and benefits. We should learn from that and maybe take some pages out of that playbook and apply it at our own law firms. Now, I'll get into why I thought this would be a useful conversation for today, specifically about brand. So when I think about what we can control for our clients, and certainly what you all can control for your law firms, it really boils down to sort of these three arenas. There's the brand that you have, sort of the message or the ideas that you're looking to communicate. You have the channels through which you want to communicate those messages, and you have the target audience to whom you want those messages communicated. I think there's a disproportionate amount of airtime spent on the channels portion of this. What's the right media mix? What are trends in CTV? What's your CPC? All things that are certainly important. But when we're talking about an increasingly competitive and sophisticated landscape, we need to be squeezing as much juice out of everything we can control as possible. And I think over-indexing on the channels, while important, is missing other areas that give you significantly more leverage as a marketer in this space. I spoke at length at this summit about how to think about target audience, and we did a really compelling research project on how to think about the client journey for personal injury law firms. For the purposes of today's discussion, I wanted to focus on brand, because I think there's a significant amount of leverage that folks can get out of thinking about their brand strategically and sort of at a 30,000-foot level that maybe they're not capturing now, because the emphasis is on like what's the return on investment on each platform. So I want to focus on this because I think that we can get significantly more value out of this as marketers if we bring the same level of sort of like intellectual rigor and focus on brand as we do some of the channel strategy that often gets discussed. So before I jump into some of the best practices and how we focus on this on behalf of our clients, I do want to just acknowledge, and I think Cassidy mentioned this in her email to everybody, there's just like practical realities. A lot of folks probably inherited a brand. I'm not sure, if they stepped into it or had the opportunity to recreate one. There's some things that are kind of like nuances to law firm marketing that I think we should address that we need to think through. But the first is obviously bar association rules. You can't just say and do whatever you want in advertisements. You need to be cognizant of those rules so you're not running afoul. Two, another practical reality that we face with a lot of our clients is like managing partner preference. It's a personal decision for a lot of our clients. It's emotional because, oftentimes it's their face up on the billboard. They're the ones who are walking around their local communities, and how the law firm is represented is a representation of them as individuals. And I don't sort of hold it against our clients for not wanting to do things that might be better from a business standpoint, but conflict with how they want to be represented in the market and what's a true reflection of their own personal identity. So that's a very practical thing we run up against. And then lastly, here is convention. And this, I would argue, is a little bit of an offshoot of number two here, but we've grown to accept what law firm brand and law firm ad creative looks like. It's oftentimes, and I included a couple samples here. The top image is just an SNL sketch, which kind of satirizes or is a parody of personal injury law firm marketing. But it's a man or man and woman in a suit, looking serious, talking directly into the camera. That's kind of like the trope of personal advertising or personal injury advertising that I think we've grown into, and I think governs a lot of how we develop creative, because we see what the rules of the road look like and we try to replicate that in our own way. But there's no rule that says this is what creative has to look like or what brand has to look like for personal injury law firms. I've included a graphic below, and to be clear, I acquired PMP from John Morgan, who is a stakeholder, but he no longer has any affiliation with PMP. That said, Morgan & Morgan is an excellent marketing company. And what they've done in some of their spots, and this is what I've included of Miss Moore, is take an approach that creatively, frankly, looks a lot more like an insurance company ad, like Geico, or there's more levity, there's more slick production value, and it makes the firm seem sort of more accessible as a result, as opposed to sometimes we skew towards scary and sort of overly emotional. So part of this is I think we have self-imposed limitations on how we think about creative conventions, and I encourage our creative team and our clients to maybe try to buck those trends and think about what exists in the mind, what's the best message that exists in the minds of your desired clients. So I want to acknowledge some of these factors that I think shape how we all collectively think about brand in this end market, if you will. Are there any other, these were the top three that came to mind for me. I don't know if anybody else faces any challenges or restrictions. Instead of just a purely academic, if I could create a brand for my law firm in a vacuum, it would look like this, but for some other constraint. These are a couple that I came up with that I see most commonly, but I'm curious if anybody has anything else that they would add to this. Okay, I'm not going to press the issue, worth asking. So I want to transition to the conversation of, brand strategy specifically and how to think about these things. We have sort of like a workshop template that we work through with our clients to identify various elements of their brand and how they should be reflected in their marketing campaigns. What I've done here is sort of simplified that. I'm abstracting some things out, and I'm going to go through a couple sample practice sort of exercises that we do that hopefully are helpful to you all. And frankly, maybe you all are doing some form of this already. And if so, I would sort of love to hear different approaches that folks are taking. But I think, before jumping into each of the pieces on this particular page, I think it's useful to think about, sorry, there's a chat message. All right. It's useful to think about brand in the context of one's own personal brand. This is how I try to describe it to our clients. As an example, like I have my own sort of sense of self. I have like my true natural personal identity. It's obviously multifaceted, as any of yours is. How I expose who I am to people oftentimes depends on the environment and the people I'm speaking with. Said it differently, how I show up in a conversation with my wife is different than how I show up in a conversation with my team, which is also different than how I show up at night having a drink with friends. There's different versions of me that show up. It doesn't mean I'm not the same person. It doesn't mean I'm wearing different faces or inauthentic. It's just I have different components to my own identity as a person, and I expose them and reflect them based on the environment and the people. You should think about a company's brand very much in the same way. There's like sort of non-negotiable, true north kind of guiding principles that you should have at your core that remain unchanged. And you should be thoughtful about how do you activate those truths in different ways based on the audience you're looking to speak to. A brand isn't exclusively for a potential client either. It's for employees of the law firm, other teammates. It's for prospective employees. So you want to have a clear sense of the kind of core values of the company so that then you can then activate against those in various ways to the benefit of the company. So as we work through various exercises here, I'll kind of continue to expand on what I mean. But ultimately, when it comes to brand strategy, there are three main components that we think about. There's the brand core, which is much of what I was just discussing. There's brand positioning, how you position your brand within the context of the market. And then there's a brand persona, how you bring it to life. It's difficult for a company to come to terms on what these things should mean, because there's multiple different points of view and perspectives, and you have to bring those together in sort of one unified approach for an entire company of people. So the other sort of challenge here is that without any sort of explicit effort to identify or document some of these concepts, you might be sort of having a good conversation, but not necessarily incorporating it into all elements of your communication, whether to existing clients, new clients, prospective clients, et cetera. So going through an effort of identifying some of these concepts helps get everyone on the same page. It also helps allow you to document some of these things so you can continue to revisit them, because ultimately your brand should be governing all of the activities that you do from a marketing perspective. And they should be coming back to what's our core truth and what are we trying to express here through our brand. So we do this with our clients. It's oftentimes in a collaborative environment with multiple PMP team members and multiple members from the client's law firm. And what you're doing is you're like having conversations that are outside the norm, that feel weird and oftentimes like crunchy, particularly to lawyers. But you're going through the process, you're hearing how other people view themselves and view the law firm and how they want to be represented. And with some of these like tactics, they act as forcing functions so you can have meaningful conversations about what is ultimately a very sort of like ethereal concept. So walking through what we do here, we've got the brand core. This is immovable, who you are. It's the purpose, your brand purpose, why you exist. Oftentimes this might tie to an overall sort of mission for a company. If any of you all do like EOS or a similar sort of operating system at your firms, maybe you've identified something like this, but it goes beyond, frankly, just marketing. It's like truly at the business level. What is your reason for existing? The vision, what you aim to achieve over time, setting a vision for, the firm, the employees, the prospective clients, and brand values, what you stand for, your non-negotiables, what you will and what you will not do, what you believe and what you don't believe. Brand positioning is understanding your target audience. Who do you want to speak to? How do they perceive you? What are their habits? You want to make sure that the brand you're constructing is appealing and resonates with those people. You also want to have an understanding and appreciation for the competitive landscape. So particularly in the local market, what brands exist there. And in, personal injury, it's like some might be more serious, some might be more playful, some might have been around for a long time. There's brand colors, there's different iconography. There's things that you want to understand your competitors are doing so that as you... Yep. Is there a question I heard? Okay. Maybe someone was just off mute. Nevertheless, you want to understand what your competitors are doing. And then the awareness channels is really the channel piece. Like once you have your brand identity and the various elements and messages, how do you communicate those to your audience and in what channels? And then lastly, brand persona. As a person, I have a personality. I show up. It's easy to understand and draw a connection with who I am if you know me. In the spirit of drawing connections, it's difficult to do that with like a faceless, personality-less law firm or company. So you want to kind of personify what the firm looks like. Sometimes that's just going to be, the face of the managing partner. Maybe it's more than that. Maybe there's, no spokesperson who's affiliated with the law firm. It really depends on sort of a bunch of different factors. Nevertheless, you want to have a brand personality so that when people are exposed to your creative, regardless of the channel, they associate a set of emotions with your brand so that they can remember it. You want to create a brand voice, similarly, to create that emotional connection. And then you manifest that through taglines. So, punchy snippets of content that either go up on a billboard or kind of how you end with a bumper on a TV ad or whatever. These are things that you want to include to, again, create the sort of emotional connection and resonance of what you're communicating through these various channels. So I've highlighted 4 items in blue here. And so we've got 4 different exercises associated with these. This is a very much like abridged version of what we normally do, but I want to illustrate what we do and how we think about this. And hopefully that sort of instigates some own internal conversations within your teams or your firms. Before I jump into this, any reactions to this? Any sort of, this is a group of marketing professionals, so I don't want to be like the guy who has all the answers about marketing. I'm curious if anything here sort of conflicts with your concept of marketing or disagree, or if you guys think about it in a different way. I'd love to hear any thoughts on that. All right.
Kyle, I'll just jump in. I'm Catherine from Facey Brooks Law Offices. Everything that you've described is very much in line with my experience of building the brand of our firm. I definitely ran into the challenges that you showed on the previous slide of, managing partner preference, historical context in the community, bar regulations, all of that. But I found a ton of value in working through the steps of building our brand strategy along the lines of what you've outlined on this slide.
Awesome. And did you, out of curiosity, was it difficult to get buy-in from team members to have these conversations, or what was that experience like for you?
The real difficulty was not in buy-in, but in accessing the data needed to be able to really nail down exactly who our target audience was. Mm-hmm. That had not been a priority in the way that cases were managed in our CRM and intake system. We really weren't collecting a lot of demographic information. And in transitioning from one CRM to another over the years, a lot of that, demographic content had been lost in the transition from one platform to another. So that has been the hardest thing. And then also once we nailed down what our target audience was, there was a lot of internal, and still is, frankly, there's a lot of internal discussion on our target customers' age range, gender, and racial identities not lining up with what are seen as our most successful advertising channels, primarily between like social media versus linear TV versus CTV. So we have a younger target audience, but we invest more heavily in the linear advertising and traditional advertising models. And that's been a real like push and pull internally to decide how we can align our spend with where the research shows our target customers are consuming the most information.
That's super common within our client base, as well as understanding who they are from the data and projecting it forward. One area that, and we'll talk a little bit about defining your target audience here in a second. One thing that we've discussed internally too is like, even in looking at the data for a given client, there might be what we would consider sampling bias, and that like, because they were your target market or the people who, signed up with your law firm previously, doesn't necessarily mean they create the comprehensive set that you would want to be your potential clients in the future. You might just be sort of continuing to fish in the same pond over and over again. And what we've found is like, some of our clients, we look at the data and it's, it skews older. And it's like, well, we should be on, linear TV more, which is fair. We should be on linear TV in those circumstances. But do they skew older because we've been advertising on linear TV for so long, and that's just what makes up the audience? If we're not advertising, if we haven't historically been advertising on, say, social media, for instance, are we missing out on a younger demographic? And so instead of like taking what has been and extrapolating that out into the future, I challenge our clients to sort of think even beyond that. What do we want our audience to look like, not just what have they looked like in the past, although that is an incredibly useful starting point. So that's interesting and yeah, consistent with what we've seen for our clients. Melanie, it looks like you have your hand up.
Yeah, I have two questions about this. One is, a while back, we were trying to do a deeper dive on our branding, and we did surveys with past clients showing some of our commercials, and some of them were more hard sell, some of them were more soft sell. And they all said, oh, no, I prefer the soft sell. Obviously, they didn't use those terms. They just like, I like commercial B, which was more of a soft sell approach. However, a lot of the attorneys at the firm were like, yeah, sure, they say that, but that doesn't mean that actually, works well. And they have like, some of them have this theory of like, what people say that they like versus what they actually react to and makes them pick up the phone are very different things. So I'm just wondering what you think on that. And the other part, the second question, for brand positioning, do you consider your market differentiators part of your branding positioning or not really?
Yeah. So I'll start with market differentiators, and then I'll sort of go back to the prior concept. Certainly you want to be thinking how you identify your differentiators is going to be a function of work you do throughout brand positioning. So understanding who you want to speak to, what those people care about, what their pain points are, and then what your competitors are saying, certainly. You want to be evaluating those things and identify what are the pain points that the target market or audience thinks about. What are the gaps in my competitors, or what are they saying? And do we fill those gaps? And so they should be informing the types of competitive differentiators that you want to highlight more in your messaging. And so that effort, surfacing those differentiators, not just all your collective differentiators, but the ones that really matter in terms of, the pain points for your potential clients and your competitors, comes through that discussion in this exercise. Because what you're trying to do is be where your competitors aren't in a way that's compelling to your prospective clients. So certainly, and I've found that in opening conversations within groups of people, everyone has their own understanding of what they believe their differentiators are. And sometimes, you know, a lot of times, in fact, what feels like a unique and powerful differentiator to one of our clients is not something that is actually relevant to a potential audience member. And it's, you know, because what we take pride in, and oftentimes what our clients take pride in, is great and valuable, but is not necessarily easily understood by somebody who hasn't gone to law school, hasn't lived their life in a law firm, who lives a very different lived experience. So having those roundtable conversations is super important to make sure you're not, again, like expressing bias into the going forward strategy. With respect to your prior comment, I think that doing any sort of surveying is like a cut above. We do broad market polls, and we'll do specific local market polls for clients, and it is incredibly illuminating to ask. We do them via Qualtrics, so it's kind of like a broad anonymized focus group based on demographics that we set, and hearing how people perceive our clients' creative or brand names, or even like recall of unique phone numbers and things of that nature is an excellent starting place for understanding what has been, and also maybe informing what should be done the same or differently in the future. So I certainly applaud that. But within research in general, there's going to be the challenge of stated versus observed behavior. People say, to your point, say they like one thing, but then they take action elsewhere. It's really difficult to cut through that. Like one example is we've got a client in Minnesota who is a fairly heavy marketer, not on radio, and we'll ask, like, where did you hear about us? And people will say, I heard about you on the radio. They've never done a radio spot. And so they're, stating that they heard them on radio, but they were just exposed to the ad in various ways, and they can't really pinpoint back to it. So that's another example of stated versus observed behavior. And I wish I had sort of like a salient, recommendation for you, because the reality is, in an ideal world, you're testing creative on those platforms that allow for sort of measurement of engagement and reaction, like a Facebook, for instance, and doing a little bit A/B testing. When you're talking about linear, for instance, or billboards, people are going to say one thing that might not be consistent with how they would react it or what their specific journey was prior to contacting a firm. It's really difficult to sort of cut through that to get a universal truth. But at a minimum, some data is better than no data, and you're getting anecdotal evidence to inform your decisions in the future. So I guess proceed with caution and challenge the assumptions of findings you get in those types of research projects. But ideally now, and certainly in the future, as CTV and other platforms, we're seeing better forms of measurement. We can get more empirical evidence to say what was somebody exposed to along their path that actually led up to them contacting the firm. Then that's sort of the pure test. But we're just frankly not there yet as an advertising technology ecosystem, certainly as an end market of our own, in my view at least. Does that all make sense? Or did I miss out any part of the question that you asked?
No, that was really helpful. Thank you.
Awesome. Cool. And then there was one, before I move forward, there was one other question in the chat from Gloria. Is it important to have only one tagline to run throughout all creative, or can you have a few different taglines to provide clarity on a couple of key missions? So great question. I think the short answer is you can have a few different taglines. When we think about it broadly, you want ubiquity and consistency. So you want to be everywhere, and you want to be consistent throughout everywhere. And that's where some of these conversations around brand are really helpful, because you can truly document the various brand elements. If you have a brand icon that's associated with how your firm name shows up, you might have that icon show up in brand creative without the firm name next to it. Similarly, your brand colors, if you've got spokespeople, that's another thing. You can be mixing and matching these brand elements in different creative on different platforms, so long as it comes back to sort of a core set of universally deployed brand elements. It actually creates a cohesive story, so it doesn't look too samey, but it does have the visual connection that you want to create that sort of resonance and recall. You don't want to have a ton of different taglines, but you want to have, a short list, and there's no magic number, but call it 3 to 5, and you change them out. So you're hitting on those things so that when someone hears our passion is justice, or fighting for you, or whatever. They associate it with your firm and not necessarily just generally law firms in general. So that's where if you get too listy on it, you might lose sort of the poignancy of each of those taglines. Awesome. Thank you very much for the contributions and the questions. I genuinely appreciate it. Okay, so let's dig into the brand core here. So this is the why. And again, just to reiterate what I said briefly earlier, this is not necessarily exclusively for marketing. This is really like a mission statement for the company, which informs downstream actions and decisions with respect to marketing. So examples here: Microsoft, Airbnb, and Google. Airbnb, we help people to belong anywhere. They're, a replacement or a substitute for hotels, basically. So it plays into that. What's their mission? It's sufficiently broad so they can do a bunch of different things in there, and it gives meaning to the service that they're providing. I would encourage you all, if you haven't, to define like your brand core for your firms. And again, it's a governing truth for the whole law firm, not just for marketing. A helpful construct that we use, and we'll put this up. We get like big sheets of paper and stuff to whatever contribution you make so that there's an impact. This is an example output from one of our clients, and what we arrived on through various conversations and people kind of going down on Post-it notes and coming up with things is to make legal representation accessible to everyone so that the powerful are held accountable. So when we think about this, if you want to make legal representation accessible to everyone, you need to have sort of a broad brand awareness vehicle to hit a wide audience with your brand message, to make sure that people are aware that they have recourse. Similarly, to the impact of holding the powerful accountable, that's going to inform how you show up in your advertisements, what you care about. It's also going to be kind of a mission statement and a cause for employees of the law firm. We show up because we want to help people. We want to hold the powerful accountable. So it's a universal concept that reflects the entirety of the business, but is truly like the North Star that we have here. Ours, for what it's worth, is to help law firms through advertising and website services so that they can reach more people, get more cases, help more people, and grow their firm. So that's an example of where, a marketing company, not a law firm, but that's how we think about our overarching purpose. Second. There we go. So another concept here that falls under brand positioning is your target audience. And we discussed looking at, historically through, farming your own data, what does your audience look like? But there's also kind of useful exercise in anecdotally creating archetypes or personas. So what we'll do here is we, put a piece of paper up on the wall with this X and Y axis. We give out sticky notes, and what we're really trying to do here is come up with 3 to 4 sort of fictional people that we believe fully reflect our target audience. And then we talk through like as if they're real people. And this is a common, exercise in marketing broadly, but is super helpful here. It's like, who are these people? What are their names? Where do they live? What kind of job do they have? What are their preferences? What do they like? What do they not like? And then we go through and we place sort of stickies up and come to an agreement on who we think our target audience looks like. And as we start to get more shape to it, we start having sort of 3 to 4 general archetypes. Then everybody can focus on each of those because they have their own concept of a client they helped in the past or interacted with, and they can, draw on that personal experience of what that person was like to reflect that up onto this fictionalized person. So an example here that was an output from one of our efforts was we came up with 3 different personas. So there's Sam, Roland, and Shalonda. Sam, the demographic here is 24, single student. He's lower household income, no healthcare, high school diploma. What he likes to do, retail therapy, he shops, he's heavy on streaming. Roland is a 45 married father. He's got lots of kids, works at the port. He's got a physical job. And he doesn't really watch TV because he's working so much and he's engaging with his family. So he's really focused on work, and it's only really accessible through a couple different touch points. And then lastly, we've got Shalonda. She's a single mother. She's got an hourly wage, no PTO. She's had previous bad experiences with personal injury attorneys. She's going to be at home watching daytime TV. So all of these things lead us to ultimately try to crystallize, like, what's the media consumption here too. So there's messaging and personalizing who we're speaking with, but it also informs, our channel strategy, because you don't want to be having ad creative speaking to Sam, the 24-year-old server that's on sort of broadcast TV, where Sam is probably not being exposed to it. So you want to be choosing your creative strategy, how you're reflecting or exposing different parts of your brand on which platforms to speak to each of these individuals. And we've, similarly, we've done this at PMP, and we've got our own personas and how we think about even writing posts on social media, our organic social media, like what we say on Instagram is meant for one audience than what we're saying on TikTok, for instance. So having this really helps crystallize who you're speaking with, regardless of the organization, but particularly for law firms. And this also challenges the assumption of, like, who do we want our target audience to be? What do they look like in the past? So it mixes some sort of outside the box thinking that you should be validating or challenging with some of the specific data resources that you have about what your target audience has looked like in the past. Has anybody done anything like this at your law firm, by the way? Okay.
We have, but we haven't revisited it in many years. So it's something that's sitting there, but we haven't gone back to it.
Yeah. And that's where it's helpful to have these conversations, not only to, like, align, but when you document it, even, it's easy to say, what best practice is. It's harder to do all the time. But when you have it documented and you can revisit it, you can step off of this call and be like, you know what, let's send an email around with, like, this information so people remember. It doesn't always have to be some massive undertaking. But once you have done the work of identifying these things, it's easier to communicate more broadly. So we have a comment in the chat real quick. Who do you think should participate in this exercise? This is from McKinley. So, for us, what we do, it's helpful for us as a third party because we're not as familiar with our firm. So I typically will involve a couple members of the team who may not even be familiar with that client's account, just to get, frankly, like, it's almost like a control group. So within your own law firm, I would encourage you to incorporate people who maybe, like, it's not exclusively just like the managing partners that are going to have a slightly different perspective and challenge those biases. So you want to get kind of like a representative group of people throughout the organization. An intake person is literally talking to these types of people all the time. And they're going to have their own perspective that probably differs than what an attorney might have, who wasn't part of the initial conversation, but has grown to really get to know somebody or somebody's family over time. So I guess there's not necessarily a specific roster of people. You don't want it to be too big because then it gets like too many cooks in the kitchen and people talking over each other. I would want to keep it to a group of maybe like 3 to 6 or 7 people and have that be sort of the core group and be very clear about what the objective is to keep people on course and contributing. But there's not like a specific roster, just kind of a diverse group of perspectives that are going to be relevant, people who like interact with in some capacity the clients or prospective clients of the law firm. Also, this might also raise observations that, like, someone in their personal life knows somebody who hired an attorney that was not your law firm. That might be a different brand persona that shows up in your data or otherwise, but it's maybe somebody that you guys would want to help, so that also uncovers who you're not talking to if people are drawing on their own personal experiences and they're coming from different parts of the organization. So that's how I would think about who to include and kind of how many people to include. And then Catherine, are these data points conjecture? Are there resources you would recommend to build these avatars off of research of some kind? I would say it's primarily, I guess it's anecdotal evidence based on the perspectives of the people who are at the law firm, so the lawyers. In our case, we're primarily dealing with the attorneys when we're having these kinds of conversations. So it's totally like their anecdotal evidence. I would, there's resources online you can pull from to come up with like starting point anecdotes, but really I found that like when you get the conversation going, people it spurs new ideas and new thoughts. So I guess there's not necessarily a library of potential personas. It's much more based on anecdotes, which, is affected by personal biases and such. So it's not perfect, but it is a good representation, at least for the purposes of like clarifying generally who are you speaking to in your creative. Gloria said, we're really pushing for this type of research to truly understand our client base. We find it very important to, quote, speak to our current lower income clientele, but equally important to learn how to speak to a more affluent audience who has better insurance. Yeah, and it's true. I think there's a concept, sort of implied concept that like lower household income and predominantly minority demographics are like the target audience, and certainly that is consistent. But there are other factors at play. And just again, anecdotally, I moved with my family from Chicago to West Palm Beach for the opportunity to join PMP, and we don't have family or like a built-in network here. And I'm not ultra wealthy, but I'm not lower income. I have a graduate degree. My wife, went to college. We would not find if we got an accident, we would not find an attorney really through word of mouth. We would have to take some form of action on marketing to find that. Thankfully, knock on wood, we haven't had to do that. But I think it's good to challenge assumptions around who the target audience is and not fall into the trap of assuming that it's all sort of lower household income and, predominantly sort of minorities. In fact, we've got research reports that suggest there's very little difference in terms of age, gender, ethnicity, and household income from an audience who would be inclined to contact a personal injury attorney after an accident versus those who would not be inclined to contact a personal injury attorney after an advertisement. So, I think it's good to challenge those assumptions. I have a couple of other things I just want to share to spur some ideas and creativity within this group, but hopefully we can end pretty close to on time. We've got 10-minute warning here. So the next helpful exercise that we try to collaborate with our clients on is finding the brand personality. And sometimes that's going to be like literally the person, the managing partner, whoever's reflected on the advertisements. But even still, even though their likeness is on the billboard and they're showing up in the advertisements, doesn't necessarily mean their personality as a person is what is fully reflected or even partially reflected through your brand messaging. So what we encourage our clients to do, even those who are going to be the brand face themselves, is like give a face and a voice to the brand. So what we'll do is we'll literally print out like 50 different sheets of paper with different sort of like celebrities or cartoon characters, and we throw them out on the table, and it's like, who do you identify with? Who do you think? And each person, again, is going to find something different. Are you sort of the Clint Eastwood badass? Are you the suave like James Bond? Are you goofy like Flavor Flav? Elegant and, like Marilyn Monroe? Sort of timeless like Dolly Parton? Are you sort of humorous but real like a Dave Chappelle? There's a bunch more here, but it's a fun conversation to be like, who do we feel like is the face of our company? And that also helps sort of crystallize things about how you want to show up. And it's a helpful way of, again, eliciting specific thoughts on something that is a very kind of ethereal thing. But once you have this, and this is an example output of, there was conflicting opinions, but we had Robin Hood and I'm blanking on To Kill a Mockingbird. I'm blanking on his name. Sorry. At the moment, if anybody can volunteer that will cause me whatever. There we go. Thank you, Atticus Finch. So that was driving me crazy for a second. So Atticus Finch. So it's like tradition and justice, but there's also sort of the clever kind of one step ahead, playful do-gooder of like the cartoon Robin Hood. So as we've actually written scripts for their TV ads and we do their graphic design for their social media ads, like we take this into account. And it's not to say each singular creative asset reflects a perfect combination of these two. Some might be more sort of Robin Hood, some might be more Atticus Finch. That, it really just sort of depends on the platform and the audience. But at a minimum, it helps you, write the copy for the Facebook post, for instance. It helps you write and edit the TV spot, for instance. Having this kind of helps bring life to what you're trying to convey to your audience. And then the last sort of sample exercise that we go through is brand voice. Like, how are you talking to your clients? Again, how are you going to be, writing these posts? We think about a couple different things in terms of a spectrum of humor, formality, respect, and enthusiasm. And we go through and we think like, we as a team will go through and look at their existing creative, and we will sort of peg what we think the tone of voice is based on our third-party perspective. But then we have a conversation with them about what they think it is, and then we talk about what they want it to be. And it leads to something that looks like this, which is, it was more serious, but we want to be a little bit more humorous. We don't want to be, we don't want to be too serious or too scary. We don't want to be too formal. We don't want to be completely casual either. With respect to respect, like, we want to be a little bit more playful. That's fun. And a lot of this is, again, is in the context of brand positioning. What does your competition look like? Are they super serious, super formal, respectful, and matter of fact? Maybe you want to think about your voice a little bit differently, so you're standing out from your competitors in a way that's hopefully authentic to your firm and the people who are representing your firm. And then enthusiastic as well. Like, are you earnest, matter of fact, or are you sort of energized and expressive? And so this is an example of the sort of white rings to the right are what we observed in our clients' content and creative voice versus what they really wanted to express. And this helped, again, clarify what the brand should look like. And that helped inform the sort of creative direction, specifically on script writing and things like that, that we've used to bring their brand to life. And then lastly, what I'd like to leave you all with is just to recap a couple of things and some takeaways. Acknowledge it is more difficult, but accept your reality and don't rest on laurels. Don't wish the competitive landscape was like what it was 5 to 10 years ago. Acknowledge that it is what it is today. And frankly, it will be quickly changing over the next 5 to 10 years. Also, acknowledge that you should be gaining leverage through your brand strategy, even though it's sort of crunchy and creative and hard to put a number on. If you're smart about it, you can get a lot of leverage out of your brand strategy that's going to augment some of the channel effectiveness that you have. I would encourage you all to be bold and challenge convention within the confines or constraints of your respective firm. But there's no rules beyond, I guess, bar association rules. So think outside the box and be thoughtful and methodical and make it fun because there's no rules, because it's creative. And the stakes are relatively low in most circumstances. Like, have fun with it, because this is like a fun part of what we do. And the more fun you have, I've found leads to a better creative output in the end. So these are just a couple like ending thoughts that I'd leave you all with as you think about this. I can send these materials. I'll send them to Cassidy, and she can distribute them if you're interested for reference. But like I said, hopefully this has instigated some new sort of activities or actions you can take to, revisit things you've done in the past, or maybe be a helpful nudge for folks to sort of lean in on some of this stuff now. And I'll also make sure my contact information is available via Cassidy too. If anybody would like to have a conversation about this offline, of course, would be happy to do so. Before we part ways, does anybody have any remaining thoughts or questions on anything we've discussed or anything else?
I actually have a question.
Okay.
Sarah Buckley, I'm the social media manager at Shuck and Stone. I agree with everything you said, absolutely spot on. I have a background in brand. It's one of my absolute favorite conversations to have. For how do you tackle managing like the clients who maybe don't see the value in going through some of these exercises?
Well, I I'm in a slightly different position because I will say that, we are strategic advisors. We will always tell our clients what we think is the right course of action, but our clients are ultimately the decision makers. And there are instances, certainly, when clients don't want to have this conversation, and we don't, frankly, push the issue because it's ultimately their decision. So that might not be necessarily like a helpful perspective, but for those who aren't comfortable with it, we certainly do the sort of like college drive explaining why it's useful, and we give creative samples of our other clients that have had a lot of success. But some folks are just going to be maybe stuck in their ways, is a little bit of a cynical way of looking at it, or just like, very personal about it, because it is their name and likeness oftentimes, and we try to honor and respect that. So I don't have any off the cuff sort of like tricks to convince the managing partner at your firm to care about this stuff. But I would say that, like, I hear a lot of our clients who maybe they've got a bad month in terms of like lead conversions or something like that on pay-per-click. And it's like, how do we get every last drop of opportunity out of that? I might use those sort of conversations you'd have internally to, address that if it exists, but also reframe it and be like, we could get a lot more mileage out of collectively what we're doing if we have a higher level conversation on how we're conveying our brand in the market. And that's a worthwhile and low cost exercise. So that's just off the cuff how I'd treat it, but we don't necessarily push too hard on our perspective or from our end if our clients are kind of resistant. We have to kind of acquiesce to what they ultimately think is best.
No, I appreciate that. I think what you said at the very end is perfect, as tying it into like a specific issue and kind of readdressing it there is really helpful. Thank you.
For sure. And having these conversations internally is like, it's people's time, but compared to a client who might be having a sort of 6-figure or 7-figure marketing budget, it pales in comparison to spending, 20 grand a month on SEO or pay-per-click. And so it's worthwhile from a business standpoint to at least carve out the time to have this conversation, in my opinion. Well, cool. I think we're at time. I think Ty might have had to drop off, but I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all. This has been fun to think about and put together on my end. And I appreciate you having me and having great questions. So like I said, if you'd like to talk further, I'll make my information available. But with that said, I hope everybody has a great rest of the week, and thank you very much for the time.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Kyle.
Mhm.
Bye.